When you're that far out from the competition, you're loading carbohydrates to about 110% of the refeed.
What's up? 筋肉翻訳です。さあ今日は初心者に試してほしい大会1週間前の調整方法を見ていきましょう。大会前の調整は特殊な食事など様々ありますよね。細かく言うとその時の状況に合わせることが大事になります。でもある程度のガイドラインがないと余計にわからなくなると思います。今回はそんなガイドラインをパーソナルトレーナーコレクティブチャンネルさんが教えてくれています。内容を見てみると使っている人たちよりも激しく削ったり増やしたりしない印象がありました。初めてコンテストに出る人も繰り返し出ている人も参考になれば嬉しいです。早速見ていきましょう。どうぞ。
Now, I want you to take a second, pause the video, and take a look at this peaking for competition schedule. This starts about roughly 1 week out, and it shows a front load. Now that you've taken the time to look it over, let's go over it in detail. Day 7 is the Saturday before the show, assuming the show is on a Saturday. So it's a full week of dietary manipulations that you want to give to your athlete beforehand and talk them through it, because it'll be unlike what they've done previously. Notice that they have 3 low days in a row, and then they have the first peak in carbohydrate. This is the highest peak they'll have in the front load, and roughly a good place to start is about 110% of their refeed. If you recall from our earlier units, a refeed should be roughly at what you think maintenance is and dominated by carbohydrate. If you're not sure where to set this should typically be between about 2 to 3 grams per pound of carbohydrate, and calories should be set at maintenance. I would advise just simply keeping fat and protein roughly similar to what they've had throughout the diet. This makes there less variables that the athlete has to manipulate, which especially for a first-time competitor, if they're changing everything, can be very stressful. And we don't want a whole lot of stress and higher cortisol levels when we're trying to get on stage. So, on day 4, when you're that far out from the competition, you're loading carbohydrates to about 110% of the refeed. Then on days 3 and 2, you're basically tapering them down. Day 3 is basically a refeed and low day average. So if they're on 200 grams of carbs on their low days and 400 grams of carbs on their high days, this would be roughly 300. Then the next day is about 90% of that value again. Both of these days should be roughly between 1 to 2 grams per pound if you don't have a refeed idea to work off of, okay? Finally, the day prior to the show, you're going to rebump the carbohydrates. This is that second peak. And depending on how they looked after the last 2 days, this should be anywhere between 85 to 105% of their refeed. The final touches are done during the day of the show. And essentially, this also depends on the format of the show. If it's a 2-part format, you're going to split your total carbohydrate intake between getting it in before prejudging and then getting it in before finals. If it's a 1-part format show, you need to think about what time does the show end and what percentage of their day's carbohydrate would they normally have in this period. If they're going to be getting off stage and finishing the whole show around 5 p.m., you probably want about 3/4 of the total carbohydrates that I recommend here consumed up to and during the competition. So, the final day is really where you need to make a subjective decision about what's an appropriate amount of carbs to have on that day. More or less, you're trying to achieve peak condition or just slightly spilled over the night prior to the show, knowing that they'll clean up a little bit overnight as they burn energy and lose some water. So, if they look slightly over-peaked when they send you pictures on Friday night, that means you can successfully maintain that look on the day of the show. If they're way past peaked, you want to go down to the lower end of my carbohydrate recommendations here. And if they're not quite full enough yet on that night, that's when you can go to the full 100%. So I recommend a broad range of about 60 to 100% of the refeed day's carbohydrates based on appearance in both the PM the night before, and if you can get pictures, in the AM the day of. Remember that sometimes internet access is going to be not great when they go to one of these shows, especially if it's in the middle of nowhere or if you're in a different time zone than your client. You may not be able to get high quality pictures on the day of the show. So I'd recommend that you rely on the PM pictures the night prior. Normally what I do is I get pictures from my client right before they go to bed so I can get an idea of what they look like with all of their food in. Then I take their appearance on that day, and based upon how close to being slightly over-peaked they are, I'll modulate their carbohydrates on the day of the show based on a 60 to 100% of their refeed target. Now the rest of the information on this slide is more or less straightforward. They can basically maintain their resistance training protocol, then make sure that they take the final 2 days off, and then just have a full body pump the night before the show, or the morning before the show, so long as it occurs about 24 hours prior. This should just be about 1 set of 12 to 20 repetitions for each muscle group, maybe gone through twice, very far from failure.
さあ、いかがでしたでしょうか。7日前から炭水化物を増減させる、タンパク質と脂質は維持させるとのことでした。 今回は特に初心者向けだったので、水や塩分はそのままですね。それでも炭水化物量のみ変化させることで大会に向けたコンディションがより良くなるということでした。もちろん事前に体脂肪がしっかりと落ちていることが重要なので、減量も頑張ってください。みんなはどんな調整をしていますか？コメント欄で教えてください。僕は事前に塩と水を大量にとって、そして後半に向けて減らしていくという方法をとっています。最後まで見ていただいてありがとうございます。セカンドチャンネルのオカザーマンチャンネルでは海外の様子をお届けしています。概要欄のリンクから見てみてください。ではまた。
I won't look back when you're around. I won't think twice when you're gone. Don't hesitate to call me back, 'cause I won't